The title of this series sprang from the level of discontent in the country and the sort of most extreme partisanship that has been seen in America since the Civil War. And that was a war. And so it seemed worthy to try to understand how we got here. What is it that makes this tick, and how is it, and how dangerous is it? I can't tell you for sure that, but I would say so far we seem to be having a war in words on the internet. If you look at social media and the things that people say and post on social media that are full of such vitriol and hatred and nastiness, downright terrible nastiness, it looks very grim. On the other hand, if instead of living these things out, taking it out on their neighbors physically, they release it in this cloud, maybe that's good. I don't know. But I know that the anger and upsetness and extreme unhappiness that people express in their postings on internet blogs and internet news sites are extreme. Have you noticed that? Have you looked at the kind of things people feel free to say on the internet? Yeah, there's something pretty terrible about that. The only thing that's redeeming about it that I can say is they're not saying it to your face. They're not physically assaulting you. It's all in the cloud. So maybe that's helpful. I don't know. But what I want to do today is continue to get underneath the present and try to get an idea of why we behave the way we do, particularly with conflict that can be war. So here we go. Today is going to focus on war and love and transcendent feelings, because they're important to make this all work. So, first of all, men, and it has been men up until this point, fighting in war, it's our inheritance from our ancestors. It's in our genes, and it's in the way our minds work, and it's in the collective mind of the culture. That's why it's there. Let me just say, we are a predatory species. We prey on others, and others will prey on us, and so we have to feel that we need to defend ourselves against others. I spoke at greater length about that last time. So, war is this interaction that takes place between predators and prey, and that's one kind of fundamental way of looking at it. So, what I wanted to begin with today is how this begins in youth. It's not something that is completely transmitted by the culture. Children are born with this predisposition, but it can be pretty quickly channeled by the culture in particular directions. So the raw emotional capacities to band together in groups and compete with the other groups, and to look unfavorably and hostilely on the other group, is very genetic. But how it plays out has a lot of features that are cultural, and they don't always have to be played out the same way. So boys naturally will confront one another. Some boys will bully, but there is a natural jockeying that takes place among boys, and every boy has to somehow come to terms with how he's going to live that out. And some turn out to be terrible bullies and actually manage to become president of the United States. Others say, I don't want anything to do with this, and enter monasteries. Others say, there's a better way to lead life, and I'm going to lead it in a religious fashion. And others don't say much one way or the other and try to get along as best they can. But there are going to be bullies, and it's part of our genetic inheritance. So one of the things that happens is that boys will naturally congregate into opposing tribes. And I'm going to tell you about an experiment that demonstrates how this happens. You don't even have to plan it very well. They actually planned it pretty well here because this is an experiment that was done back in the 1950s. And a group of something like 40 boys gathered together, and they were segregated into two groups. There was a camp situation. They were like at camp, and there were going to be camp activities, and there were two residences. And so the residences where the boys were different. And that right away makes a division. It turns out you don't have to do that. If you just bring 40 boys together and let them interact, they'll do it by themselves. They will segregate into two groups. You don't have to be boys. If you bring 40 adults together in a 2 or 3 day program that's got some kind of purpose, they will segregate into groups. Here is the video of this experiment, which we can take in now.
The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the two groups were made aware of each other, they were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug of war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sheriff believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank and the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together. At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Musafar and Carolyn Sheriff had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
Thank you. So, boys will be boys, and they do grow beyond adolescence. And so, I will now show you a video where now boys are in gangs, and as you know, gangs naturally arise. You can't stop them from arising. It's possible that if you have a more nurturing society that brings children into very productive ways of being, rather than just simply tossing them to the wilds in the inner city, that this kind of gang behavior would be much less. Or the gangs would be productive gangs, like the National Football League or the baseball leagues. These would be competitive, but they wouldn't be destructive. So I'm now going to show you a very brief clip of city gang warfare, and I'm sure you've seen plenty of movies where there's gangs and there's warfare, but this is actually a real thing. So we start with just two boys confronting each other in the locker room. We see groups of boys form gangs, and we go on up from that. So from gangs to armies of soldiers. This is actually a reenactment of which modern people like to reenact army events of the past. And this is a Roman, it's not a battalion, I'm not sure what this size squad would be called, but it's a Roman enactment. They are trying to look like Romans with the kind of armor that Romans would have had. This is a 18th century confrontation. These are Napoleonic troops. And you can see they have very primitive guns. This is a World War II group of soldiers. They're actually Australians. And this is a very modern group of soldiers. This is in one of the many military parades that they have so much of in North Korea. So the army of soldiers is a natural progression up from, first of all, the competition that took place between two boys, the competition that took place between groups, the competition that took place between gangs, the competition that takes place between nations. And what's going on here is that tribes, nations, prey on one another. They will try to take things from one another. They will steal land. And tribes correspondingly defend themselves against predation. So you're both a predator and a defender against predation. And the combination of those two things ultimately leads to war. Now, if you're going to have a civilization at all, there's got to be some limit to this, because you can't just be at war all the time. And we have evolved a way of having wars that's there's no plan for this. There's no handbook that nations look at to say, we have to do this. It's all internalized, and it comes just naturally that you cannot let the casualties get more than about 6 or 7%. Because if they do, you're not going to have any soldiers for the next generation if they were 30% or 40%. So wars always have low casualties, which also, unfortunately, is what guarantees they will continue. Because if the casualty rate in warfare was 50%, you couldn't go to war again until another generation grew up. That would be at least 15 years or 20 years, and you couldn't do it. So we have somehow managed to find our way as a species to control our wars unconsciously to never get above the 10% of rate. If it did, war would stop. But it's proved that we would rather be predators because you get rewards for being a predator. I illustrated how, just a simple example of how in the Spanish-American War, the Spaniards were defeated in Cuba because the Spaniards had colonies in the New World, and they got into a fight with the Americans in Cuba, and they were defeated by the Americans. And then the Americans, under Teddy Roosevelt, said, Spain's got some other colonies, let's go get them. So they went to the Philippines and took the Philippines away from Spain. And that's why there's always been a close American-Filipino relationship, until recently. So the prey-predator quality of human species, there is money to be made by preying on others, and there is money to be conserved by defending yourself against predation. And it makes for war. Now, war has to have a lot of mythology around it because no one wants to be killed. So how do you get people, and it's not as though there's any intelligence behind this, there is just evolutionary forces that work on the mind and work on the way we behave socially that do it. And one of them is the great myth of war. The myth of war is that there are good people in the world and there are bad people in the world. And there's truth to that. There are some individual, rather nasty people in the world. But the myth of war doesn't say that. It says there are good people in a nation in the world, and there are bad people in a nation in the world, and that nation is good, or that nation is bad. It's not individual. It's made to apply to the entire group. And you can think back to the little video about the rattlers and the other group. But the myth of war is replaced by the truth of war. The truth of war is that good people kill other good people. That's what's really going on. And that's not easy to make happen. We don't like to kill people. We have a natural built-in resistance to killing. You might not think so, but if you think about it, it's true. We do not want to do that. It makes us sick. It makes us terribly upset to try to be forced to kill somebody. So, this is the invasion of Normandy in 1944. Let me just back up because I wanted to say something before this about good people and bad people. People will always want to raise the issue of, well, what about Hitler? Well, yes, Hitler was a pretty nasty guy, but he did die finally of suicide. But there's something that's not quite right, thinking that Hitler is the cause of all of this. Because here is the invasion of Normandy, into the war, 4 years into the war. Hitler is not present here. He's not here. But 450,000 people over the course of this invasion will lose their lives. Were these all nasty people? Were these all monsters? Not at all. Not at all. So, we compare our most noble people with the most brutal of the other. So we overcome our strong natural resistance to kill others by the thrall of a transcendent state in combat. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today, is how is an individual man's psychology changed in war? And it's changed also to bring forward enormous experience of love. So the emotional state of, I would say most, certainly many men in battle, is to be in this transcendent state. Others will be just plainly terrified, just terribly terrified, and there's plenty of those too. But there are many that get into this transcendent state. And there's a history of it. In the Bible, Saul and David are jousting with one another back and forth, and Saul has a son, Jonathan, and David and Jonathan are dear friends. And David and Saul were killed in battle. And when Jonathan and Saul were killed in battle, and when David came upon the bodies, he exclaimed in 31 Samuel 1, "Jonathan, I loved thee more than women." And that's true in many ways. I know some young men who have been I know one in particular who is a relative who was in Afghanistan in combat. And he reports exactly the same thing. "I so miss my fellow soldiers. I loved those men." And he was just an ordinary 23-year-old guy living in Tracy, California, not terribly well educated. There's an interesting fellow who I've heard speak. His name is Pete Kilner. I've misspelled his name there. It's Kilner, not Kilmer. And he speaks about this phenomenon. He actually teaches at West Point. And I saw him at a debate that was held a few weeks ago at Radford University on the morality of war. And he was speaking on the side of war is necessary and is moral, although he certainly doesn't like it and is not a proponent of war. But he says, hidden beneath the ugly destructiveness of war is a sublime beauty that is known only to the veterans who have experienced it. Soldiers at war are living and dying for something greater than themselves. Deployed soldiers are 100% committed to accomplishing this mission. They live and work together night and day, week after week, for months. In combat, everyone has the same agenda: to accomplish their mission at the cost of their own lives, and to protect each other's lives. The shared purpose and commitment to the mission and to each other creates deep bonds of love. The greater the dangers and adversities soldiers face and overcome, the greater those bonds. Some soldiers become closer to each other than to their families. And this is testified to over and over again. I just want to mention that no one of the enemy is mentioned here. There is no mention of an enemy. There is no mention of another whole set of human beings who are involved in this. So in the transcendent state of combat and in love with the one's comrades, the other, the enemy, the dirty Japs, those rotten Germans, those towel heads, they don't appear. The one to be killed isn't in the consciousness. It's purged, it's disappeared, it's floated away. And now one is free to kill. This is a photograph from World War II of a German company, obviously taking rest, just relaxing. I would like you to not look so much at the uniforms, although you can't miss them, but look at the faces, the different facial types. I think this one, you can't quite see his face because he's smoking. look at the body types, they're actually kind of different. They're different. This one looks very intellectual-like. He could well be a college student, or maybe even beyond. These are ordinary people. These are ordinary good people. Why are they in uniform? Because of war. Because of the power of war. Here we have a bunch of American soldiers. They've been through the same thing. They are just ordinary guys. Some of them aren't wearing their helmets, so you can see these are ordinary men, perfectly ordinary men that you'd be happy to meet. And they are the enemy. Now, these two groups, this group and this group, are going to kill each other. These perfectly ordinary men are going to kill each other. And I won't show you the plenty of footage that I could show you of what happens when they kill each other. Let me show you one more thing here. These are Brits. These are British soldiers. And it looks to me like they've got a Frenchman or two with them. This is also in the Second World War. I think the place is in Alsace, so it's a kind of combination French-German area. But if you look, they're perfectly happy, ordinary people. But they are going to get killed by these guys. And these guys are going to get killed by those guys. They're going to kill each other. That is the mythology of war. That is how it works. And one of the important things that happened was that in this highly excited state where you're out protecting your comrades, and you will hear soldiers always talk about how I'm here to protect my men. I'm here to protect my friends. I'm here to bring them back alive. But the one you will kill, you don't talk about. But there is, in that other side, a similar thing going on. I have read the diary of Dang Tri. She is a North Vietnamese nurse who wrote a diary during the Vietnam War. And she was with the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, that were fighting the Americans. And you get to meet all of these soldiers. They're Vietnamese soldiers. They're just kids. They're 18 and 19, 17. Same thing as on the American side. But you never see them from the American side. And to tell you the truth, the American media never will show you things like that. Nor will the North Vietnamese media show you anything about the humanity of the Americans, which is surely existing just as much. So the demonizing of the enemy is really important to making this work. And when you actually get in and know them, they are people you would perfectly be happy to be with, to share as fellow human beings. So part of the mythology, in addition to how you're in it for your friends, you're in it to bring them back alive, and you never think about the enemy. Another aspect of that mythology is war as glorious. War as an epic drama of gods, men, and heroes. And this is always also brought out by people who try to understand war. It's not all bad. It's not all wrong. There's something important to the human condition that needs war even. So the war is epic, and gods and men as heroes. The great epic of that is the Iliad of Homer, in which the two heroes, one on the Trojan side and one on the Greek side, are Hector and Achilles. And it is a masterpiece of literature. It is telling a story about war that is perfectly valid. I will not deny the validity of that story. But I will also say that story is invalid for today. So, in this, all of the heroes, in many cases, they die gracefully. They die wondrously, and they slay gracefully. It's a very powerful book, and if everybody who's in Western civilization and would like to be educated should try to get in touch with that. This is somebody I think is quite interesting, because even after the epics of hundreds of, or if not thousands of years ago, these attitudes, these ideas that war is glorious and necessary still persist. And you can find people today who also will pronounce them as necessary and glorious. This is an interesting fellow. I happen to know a whole lot more about his great nephew, who also carries this name of Helmuth von Moltke. Helmuth von Moltke, the elder, was a general. He's a Prussian. He was a general in the Prussian army. And he had many notable successes, and he lived to be 91. And he had this to say about war, and in particular, that perpetual peace is a dream, and it is not even a beautiful dream. War is an element in the order of the world ordained by God. In it, the noblest virtues of mankind are developed: courage, the abnegation of self, faithfulness to duty, the spirit of sacrifice. The soldier gives his life. And those are all the things we just saw. The enemy's not present. There's no enemy here. It's all just the soldier of his side. And von Moltke goes on to say, without war, the world would stagnate. And there are many people who believe that today. Well, I think we have reached a turning point in history. We happen to be living through a very important turning point in many, many ways. In many ways. This is a really big changing time in the history of our species that we happen to be born into and are living through. So this is the end of the glory of war as an epic myth in our time. This is my judgment. And here, to kind of give some substance to it, is Helmuth James von Moltke. He's the great-grandnephew of the gentleman we just heard from. He opposed Hitler's war. He was a very devout Christian. And he was executed in January of 1945 for opposing Hitler's war. Same family. Something changed in that family. Something changed. Something else changes. This is how war is waged nowadays and beyond. We have air power and we drop bombs, and this is the result. This is not glorious. This is not a great epic in which heroes die and are remembered. This is a disease. This is more analogous to cancer. This is a disease of the genetic emotional system, of the emotional system and mind and of human males in our time. And the reason it's a genetic disease is because it is now maladaptive. It was enormously successful for most of the run of our species. If you didn't get into throwing off predators, you would probably, your genes are not present. So you had to get into war. And if you got into war and took things away from other tribes, you did better. You produced more offspring. Those genes flourished. But this is maladaptive. Those genes that are still running in male brains today are maladaptive. Mal means badly, badly adapted. They are destructive. And that can happen. A gene that protects against cystic fibrosis, for example, by increasing the fluids in the breathing tracts, developed because our ancestors had very smoky, dusty environments. They didn't have inside buildings. And there were fires to contend with, and smoke, and sandstorms. But when this gene, if you have 2 copies of this gene, and then it's very maladaptive, and it's debilitating. And the truth is you don't need it anymore. So that's what a gene that once was necessary is no longer necessary. And the genes that go to configure the emotional system of men, and to some extent the women and children that are part of their tribe, these genes are maladaptive. You can see it. It's just so obvious when you look at what's going on in Syria. This is a war where everybody's losing, and yet nobody knows how to stop it. Sounds like cancer, doesn't it? It is a cancer, a kind of cancer. It's a genetic disease of the male brain and emotional system. And finally, there's this. War is, as somebody cynically said, there isn't any money in war anymore. And maybe that's what'll stop it. So war has become maladaptive. Our brains and minds are in the process of adjusting to a new reality. And not everybody's adjusting. There are some people who still want to go out and win wars. So war as might, as a force, and I'm using a phrase that was coined by Simone Weil, war as might. And it captures the idea of it. First of all, she wrote in French, and she called it a force, which is fine, but the might gives it a bigger magnitude. It's more than just a little force, like my fingers pushing. It's more like a whole body pushing. So might, she didn't have any she didn't appreciate or know anything about modern evolutionary biology. But she had enough observation and enough perception to see that there was something going on in people that they weren't in control of, that no one seemed to be in control of. Even the gods didn't seem to be very much in control of it in the epics that she studied. She was a Greek scholar, and she studied very seriously the Iliad. So, war is not ordained by God, as von Moltke said. It's an evolutionary inheritance from our predatory ancestors, now in our genes and culture. Now, evolutionary means changeable. That's what evolution means. You're not going to always be the same. You're going to evolve. It's change. And most modern people don't appreciate that aspect of the theory of evolution. It's enormously promising theory because it says things don't have to be the way they are all the time. So, the environment of war as world war and weapons of mass destruction, from napalm to nuclear and biological weapons, has changed. It's obvious. It has changed. That's not even debatable. And large parts of the human community now see that that's true, but not everyone does. Unfortunately, the people we have in the White House right now don't. They're ready to go to war again. So, this is our awakening time, that we have been operating thoughtlessly in the past as automaton predators. And I threw the word automaton on there. An automaton is a robot. We don't think about it. We just do it. And we defend what we do with the standard stock phrases that people throw around. But they haven't deeply thought about it, or thought about it so deeply that it would change their opinion. So, thoughtfulness, that's something new. And when we look at our species here, we only go back, say, 10 million years. And from about 1 million years ago, we are pretty much human beings. And 250,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens brain had reached about the size that it has now. And that's up here. But it's very large. What is it all about? It's all about thinking. It's all about this enormous prefrontal cortex, which can do enormous amounts of computation. Our brains are infleshed computational devices. They're not like your computer. They're more diverse, they're more capable, they can do much more interesting kinds of connectivity, but they are computers. Nonetheless, they are computers. And this computer has gotten very big, which means maybe it can think about its own situation. Maybe in concert with all those who have studied our origins as Homo sapiens and have done the anthropology and have done the evolutionary biology and understood how we got where we are as a predatory species, maybe we can learn from that. Maybe we can look at ourselves and learn, and that takes thought. It takes thought. You can't just mouth phrases like we have in our national, the way we share information nationally is really so impoverished. And we will culturally evolve, or we will perish. That's the way evolution works. If you didn't evolve and the environment changed, you left the scene. That's the way it works. That's pretty much the gist of what I have to say, but I wanted to read a little bit of Simone Weil. In a way, I feel she deserves a whole lecture of unto herself, and I might still do that sometime. But I will read a little bit of what she has to say. She was a scholar, a Greek scholar, and a very good one. And she studied and taught the Iliad. And so that forms a large part of her thinking and her frame of reference. And it is an appropriate one. It is the masterpiece epic of war for Western civilization. So how many people know pretty much the story in the Iliad of the war, the Trojan War between the Greeks and the Trojans and the two heroes, Hector and Achilles? Yeah, that's good. Okay. So in the climactic scene where Achilles and Hector finally have come to face each other down, and Hector will lose this battle. The Trojan hero will lose. And they have been chasing each other around for several passages now, and they have finally come to where Hector says, "I am at thy knees, Achilles. Have pity, have regard for me." He's fallen down on his knees. "Here as a supplement, O son of Zeus, I am worthy of respect." He's asking Achilles to respect him. "It was first at your house that I ate the bread of Demeter, when from my well-tended vineyard you captured me, and selling me, you sent me far from my father and my own. To holy Lemnos, a sacrifice of 100 oxen were paid for me. So they've been at this for some time, fighting with each other. I was redeemed for 300 more. Dawn breaks for me today for the 12th time since I returned to Ilium after so many sorrows, again at the mercy of your hands. A cruel fate has placed me. How Zeus the Father must have hated me, to have delivered me to you again. For how small a part in life did my mother, Lathio, daughter of the ancient Altos, bear me. And Achilles says, come, friend, you must die too. Who are you to complain? Patroclus, this was Achilles' companion, was worth much more than you, yet he is dead. In the epic, Patroclus does die. And I, handsome and strong as you see me, I who am of the noble race, my mother was a goddess, even over me hangs death and a dark destiny. Whether at dawn, in this evening, or at noon, my life too shall be taken by force of arms. And Simone Weil says, such is the nature of might. Its power to transform a man into a thing is double, and it cuts both ways. It petrifies differently, but equally the souls of those who suffer it and of those who wield it. The winning of battles is not determined between men who plan and deliberate, who make a resolution and carry it out, but between men drained of those faculties, transformed, fallen to the level of either of inert matter, which is all passivity, or to the level of blind force, which are all momentum. So Hector has become helpless dust, and Achilles has become a blind force. The resulting whole world would be a dismal monotony, were there not sprinkled here and there luminous moments, brief and divine moments in the souls of men. So Simone, in her perceptiveness, sees that in the midst of this disaster, there are little sprinklings of grace. And she goes on to recount them. Hector, of course, is going to die, and she's speaking about him here. Married love, condemned to misfortune, is of surprising purity. The husband, in evoking the humiliations of slavery which await his beloved wife, because the men who are defeated in battle will become slaves. Actually, they'll become concubines of the winning warriors. Omits to mention that one of which only to think would be to forecast memories that would soil their tenderness. Nothing could be more simple than the words spoken by his wife to the husband who goes to his death. It were better for me, if I lose you, to be under the ground. I shall have no other refuge when you have met your fate, nothing but griefs. And no less moving are the words addressed to the dead husband. You are dead before your time, my husband, so young, and I your widow, am left alone in the house with our child still very little, whom we bore, you and I, the ill-fated, and I doubt he will ever grow up, for you did not die in bed, stretching your hand to me, nor spoke wise words that for always I might think on, while shedding tears day and night. Now there's one final scene I'm going to read to you from the Iliad. It's when the battle has raged to the point where Hector's father is Priam, is that right? Yeah. He's not just a warrior of Priam's, he's actually a son of Priam. So Hector's father is Priam, who is the king of the Trojans. And Achilles is the big hero of the Greeks. And Achilles manages to make his way in secret to come to Priam. Priam comes to Achilles? In secret. Yeah. And he's coming to claim the body of Hector. And they have a feast when he arrives. You have hospitality for your guests. In the Iliad, there is the verse reads, "But when the desire to drink and to eat was appeased, then Dardanian Priam began to admire Achilles. How mighty and handsome! He had the look of a god. And Dardanian Priam, in turn, was admired by Achilles, who gazed at his beautiful visage and drank in his words. And when both were assuaged by their contemplation of each other." Well, there's much more to say about this. But here's a final word from Simone Weil. "Only he who knows the empire of might and knows how not to respect it is capable of love and justice." So we admire power, we admire might. It's not just the President of the United States who does that now, particularly more so than anyone we've ever had. But it's common. It's common all over the world. And Simone Weil is saying, don't respect it. Do not respect it. And you have a possibility then of having an understanding of love and justice. So that's all I'm going to say today, and we will now have some questions, if you'd like, and discussion.